All right, we have more changes unfolding in presidential politics. Changes that have new polling released today showing major movement against the Democrats, most particularly with the race for president, where Trump now carries a substantial lead in the popular vote in the national polls. This could be historic. If these numbers are accurate, if they carry through till Tuesday, we could be about to witness a landslide the likes of which we haven't seen since 1972, since Richard Nixon versus George McGovern. We're going to look at the numbers. All of this following the vicious backlash the Kamala Harris team witnessed after Tuesday night's garbage comments where the President of the United States called Trump supporters writ large garbage. Yes, that pissed a lot of people off, and we have the proof. According to Frank Luntz, Establishment Washington's go-to pollster, they love that guy for some reason. Well, he says those comments are already showing up in the data and will likely cost Harris her path to 270. But before we get started, thank you for liking and sharing these videos. It really helps out the channel. And consider subscribing so you don't miss these regular updates. So in 1972, the media, the Democrat machine came out in full force against Richard Nixon. Very similar to what we're seeing with Trump. It's worse now, throwing everything they could at the man and at his movement. But in the end, it didn't matter. On election day, the people had spoken and Nixon won in a national landslide, sweeping the country, winning 520 electoral votes versus George McGovern's 17. Yes, Nixon won California, he won Oregon, he won Washington. The only two he lost were Connecticut and, of course, the belly of the beast, Washington, D.C. Well, 3 months ago, this is exactly what the Dems were afraid of. They saw this same scenario playing out with Trump v. Biden, so they usurped the will of the people, usurped their own voters, and swapped Biden with Kamala Harris. This was a test, people, an experiment to see if you could win a short election with an untested candidate who received 0 votes, by the way, by her own party. And it's looking more and more likely that their experiment is going to fail. And good riddance. JL Partners, a big polling outlet, just released new numbers this morning, Thursday morning, showing Donald Trump opens 3-point lead over Kamala Harris in final poll before Election Day, writing this: former President Trump could be in line for a shock win in the popular vote. These new polls carry a 3% margin of error, they say. Well, check this out. Donald Trump has overtaken Kamala Harris in the final JL Partners national poll before Election Day, with the former president holding a 3-point lead over the vice president. The poll of 1,000 likely voters, which has a margin of error plus minus 3.1%, shows that Trump is trending up with the support of 49% to Harris's 46%. The race, they say, is still close, yet with 5 days to go, the numbers mean Trump is currently on course to become the first Republican candidate since George W. Bush in 2004 to win the popular vote. The founder of JL Partners goes on to say this: the poll was good news for Trump's chances of winning the White House. The movement under the surface suggests Trump is having a better closing moment in driving up enthusiasm than Harris is, obviously. And undecideds and third-party candidate supporters have also broken for Trump in the last month. This is after the disastrous closing message Kamala delivered on Tuesday night. Instead of going to Middle America, to Pennsylvania, or to Michigan, or to Wisconsin and talking to everyday people, where does she go? She goes to the belly of the swamp, to Washington, D.C., where all the bureaucrats and swamp people came out to attend.
Donald Trump intends to use the United States military against American citizens who simply disagree with him. People he calls, quote, the enemy from within.
And while she was delivering her closing message, the President of the United States was 1,000 yards behind her, tucked away in the residence of the White House, denigrating half the country, the majority of the country. If you believe these poll numbers, roll the tape.
Or Puerto Rico, where I'm in my home state of Delaware, they're good, decent, honorable people. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters. His demonization is seen as unconscionable, and it's un-American.
The only garbage I see floating out there are his supporters, Trump's supporters. The only garbage I see out there are his supporters. There you go. Now, is this breaking through? Will this have an impact? Well, according to Frank Luntz, Establishment Washington's preferred pollster, they love that guy for some reason, don't ask me why, He says yes. Watch this.
Because it reminds me so much of 2016, and I think there are a lot of similarities right now between this campaign and that campaign. The divisions in the country were significant back then. People didn't think Trump had a chance back then. He's been gaining and gaining. The momentum, I don't know who's going to win. I can't call it, and nobody should, because statistically and polling and focus groups, it is way too close to call. However, the momentum is clearly, in what I see and what I hear, is in his favor. And so every word, every phrase, every misstep, every gaffe matters as those last remaining persuadables make their decision. I don't believe in the undecided anymore. I don't believe there's undecided.
And wait till you see how the media is spinning all of this. We have some amazing clips to show you, but first, some context. We've just spent 2 or 3 full days being gaslit about how comedy's bad, apparently, listening to corporate media hyperventilate over a joke by a stand-up comic. A stand-up comic's joke about garbage floating in the Atlantic. A comedian who spoke 8 hours before Trump even arrived at Madison Square Garden. Literally, Joy Reid and Mika Brzezinski had meltdowns over Kill Tony, over Tony Hinchcliffe's joke. But when the sitting president of the United States calls half this country, more than half, the majority of the country, garbage, it's crickets. Barely a peep of outrage. Here's how they responded writ large. Watch this.
They're trying to make a firestorm out of something that, again, if you look at it, you look at what he said immediately afterward, which Donald Trump didn't say. He immediately afterwards said, no, that's not what I meant. I was talking about the comedian and people that supported that kind of talk. But, you know, Willie, Joe Biden obviously doesn't believe that.
You know, I'm of the mindset that if you say it, you might as well just embrace it. And I do think that that's a problem for realistically, like, I do think if he said, listen, yeah, I do mean all those racist supporters of Donald Trump. Yeah, I do think that they're terrible.
By the way, as someone who had a stutter growing up, it's very obvious to me that there's an apostrophe at the end of supporters there. He was referring to the garbage spewed by supporters, not simply the supporters themselves.
Basically calling Puerto Ricans trash.
The most repulsive racial jokes about Latinos.
Disgusting and hateful.
So incredibly crude.
Frankly, just too X-rated to play here.
Extremely vile so-called jokes.
And NBC's take on the comments were probably the most egregious example of gaslighting yet. NBC's Kelly O'Donnell giving this long-winded explanation about why Biden's garbage comments came out that way, saying it's due to his lifelong battle with stuttering. Trying to explain this in this huge answer. Watch this.
Kelly, first to you. Tell us about this apostrophe.
Well, I've had one my whole life, and it has never been more powerful than in a moment like this, where what they are trying to say is that the president was referring to the demonization being garbage from one prominent supporter, the comedian who appeared at the Madison Square Garden event for Donald Trump. If you look at about a minute's worth of the remarks from President Biden when he was speaking to Latino groups last night, that context appears more clear. Also, it's important to know that the president always has that battle against stuttering, and that seemed to be apparent in this as well. And clearly, this is a verbal gaffe that is problematic politically. The question for voters to decide is the president's intent here to somehow say something critical about supporters of President Trump, or was it about the supporters that we know exist, this comedian and others, who were demonizing Puerto Ricans? We're left in a position now, as anyone who looks at this, to make their own assessment. One other context clue is that the president came out quickly and used social media posts to say what he was intending to say, and that any other inference is not what he intended, that he was trying to be critical of the demonization of Puerto Ricans and not some sort of a broadside against Trump's supporters. It all matters because it plays into a concern that certainly supporters of President Trump and the MAGA movement believe is liberals thinking poorly of them broadly.
So look, the double standard, it's mind-boggling. You know this. We all know this. We've seen it for years now. What's happening, though, now is the establishment knows Trump is unstoppable and that he very well could win on Tuesday and win big. Harris, she's a terrible candidate. Their messaging is terrible. And they see what's happening in the polls. Internal polls apparently are worse than the public polls, which is why we're starting to see them freak out, hyperventilate. Michigan Congresswoman Debbie Dingell just went on CNN and told Jake Tapper she's preparing her family now for next week because she believes after next week she may end up in an internment camp. That Trump has plans to build internment camps within the United States. And this clip's important. I'm going to explain why after I play it for you, because there's a bigger strategy at work here. Roll the tape.
He wants to start internment camps. And that's what we are busy talking to every voter. He's telling you what he's going to do. Believe him.
Internment camps?
Yes. He has talked internment camps. You know what, Jake? You may have to visit me in one. I get worried enough when he talks about what he's going to do to his political enemies. But he has talked about them in this with different groups of people.
So here's what's concerning to me. All the propaganda we've been fed for the last 3 months, labeling Trump as a aspiring dictator, claiming he wants to use the military and the security apparatus of this country against his political opponents, against Americans. I believe it's not just a campaign strategy. It's the same thing we saw them do, in my opinion, during 2020, during the 2020 campaign with J6. It was a narrative they were building for after the election. This time it's a narrative of Trump unleashing the state against Americans. They've been developing this, characterizing Trump as a tyrant. It lets them establish conditions for massive rioting post-election, should Trump win. Think about it. Should he win, what if we were to see massive organized riots intended on destabilizing the country? Think about that. If that were to happen post-election, we see these riots explode, just like we did after George Floyd, but even bigger. What would President Trump have to do? He'd have to try and get it under control. The newly elected president would be compelled to do something. If police are overwhelmed, could he be convinced to invoke the Insurrection Act or something like that and order the military or National Guard to regain control of these cities? I could totally see that playing out. Then the media's narrative about Trump unleashing the military against Americans suddenly becomes reality. All of this, I'm afraid, could be part of a post-election strategy to oust him, to rock his administration with so much chaos and riots in the first few weeks. It's Operation Chaos, ladies and gentlemen. Be ready for that and don't fall for it. All right, that wraps up this episode. Like, subscribe. We'll see you next time.